Second, every one of these quakes releases energy that had been building for years, sometimes decades. That's not nothing. It's a reminder that this boundary is alive, active, and constantly working through stress even when it's not making headlines. Third, and maybe most importantly, this is a chance to talk about the risk that actually matters every single day in New Zealand, independent of any cluster near Tonga. The Hikurangi subduction zone and the Alpine fault are constant, ongoing hazards. They don't need a nearby earthquake swarm to become dangerous. They're dangerous on their own all the time, cluster or no cluster. D, specifically with major subduction and strike slip events in mind, and public education around drop, cover hold, and tsunami evacuation is baked into the culture in a way that most earthquake-prone regions still haven't managed. EDI, GeoNet, the country's monitoring network, tracks thousands of earthquakes a year across the whole country and its surrounding islands. And that constant data collection is exactly how scientists can quickly tell the difference between background activity and something genuinely unusual. That's not a coincidence. That's a country that has taken its geology seriously for a long time, largely because it's had no other choice. It's worth being upfront about what would make scientists and me take this a lot more seriously, because nothing to worry about shouldn't mean nothing could ever change. A few signals would shift the picture significantly. The first is depth and location converging on a single patch of the boundary rather than spreading out. If future events start clustering tightly around one segment instead of scattering across 2,000 kilometers, that can indicate a specific patch of the fault is being loaded rather than the whole boundary just doing its normal background business. The second is a clear foreshock main shock pattern. Right now, this sequence has no single dominant event that the others are clustering around. If one of these locations produces a noticeably larger earthquake, say a 6.5 or higher, in the same tight window and location as the earlier smaller ones, that changes the interpretation from background swarm to possible foreshock sequence, which is a very different conversation. The third is any measurable change in strain along the Hikurangi or Alpine fault themselves, detected through GPS ground stations or seafloor sensors, not just inferred from a nearby earthquake map. Scientists watch these instruments precisely because they can catch subtle loading changes well before anyone would feel anything at the surface. None of those three things are currently being reported. That's an important distinction between watching closely and sounding the alarm. Right now, we're in watching closely territory, not alarm territory. It's also worth remembering how monitoring actually works in practice, because it's easy to picture scientists staring at a screen waiting for a red flag to pop up. It's slower and more methodical than that. Seismic networks record thousands of small events a year across this region, and analysts look for changes in rate, changes in depth distribution, and changes in the spatial pattern of events over weeks and months, not just the dramatic 30-hour window that makes for a good headline. A cluster like this one gets logged, cross-checked against historical background rates for that exact stretch of trench, and compared to how similar our swarms have resolved in the past. That process, unglamorous as it is exactly how someone can confidently say, this looks like normal background activity, instead of just guessing based on how a map looks at a glance. Eruptions? Being part of that system is exactly why a boundary that most people have never heard of can matter so much. Energy transfer, stress patterns, and seismic activity across the ring of fire don't respect the neat borders we draw on maps. A major event anywhere along this horseshoe tends to get scientists everywhere else along it paying closer attention, not because one causes the other in a direct chain reaction, but because it's a reminder that the whole system is dynamic and interconnected in ways that are still being studied. That's part of why events like this deserve coverage even when the conclusion is reassuring. Understanding how these systems behave, what's normal background noise, and what's a genuine warning sign is exactly the kind of literacy that helps people react appropriately instead of panicking or just as dangerously tuning out entirely. So let's answer the question directly. Will this specific cluster of earthquakes near Tonga and the Kermadec Trench trigger a disaster in New Zealand? Based on everything we currently know, no. There's no mechanism, no precedent, and no evidence pointing that direction. Op at magnitude 5.6. That's not fear-mongering, that's just what an active, fast-converging subduction zone eventually does. The honest answer is that the risk was always there. This cluster didn't create it. It just gave us a reason to look at the map and remember it. Stay informed, not alarmed. That's the whole point of watching this stuff closely. It's tempting, when a map lights up like this one did, to jump straight to the most dramatic possible outcome. But the more useful skill, and honestly the more responsible one, is learning to sit with an answer. That's less exciting than the big one is coming, but far more accurate. This is an extremely active plate boundary doing what extremely active plate boundaries do, and the real, ongoing risk to New Zealand exists whether or not this particular cluster ever happened. That's not a reason to stop paying attention. If anything, it's a reason to pay attention to the right things. The slow, unglamorous work of monitoring networks, GPS stations, and seafloor sensors that track real strain accumulation on Hikuran. J, and the Alpine Fault. Rather than reading tea leaves off a map of moderate earthquakes and assuming a hidden pattern that isn't there. The scientists watching this data for a living aren't sounding alarms right now, and that matters more than any dramatic-looking cluster on a seismic map. If you want to understand more about what's happening across the wider Pacific Ring of Fire right now, including significant volcanic activity further north near Kamchatka, that's a conversation worth having next. And it ties directly into how INTI,